Are we live?
I think we might be live.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Hello, I'm Anuschka Berthelius from the SCHIRN, and I'm very happy to talk to Ed Fornieles today. Hi, Ed. Thank you for joining us. The talk will be for around 30 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A where everyone will have the chance to ask questions inside the webinar from Zoom. So everyone watching at YouTube or Facebook, you have to come to Zoom to the webinar to ask questions. I will briefly introduce you to Ed Fornieles, an artist mostly working with film, performance, and sculpture, often creating immersive environments, continually blurring the boundaries between reality and virtuality. Apart from exhibitions at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, the Serpentine Gallery in London, or the New Museum in New York, his work has already been shown at the SCHIRN several times. Most recently, in context of the exhibition Peace in 2017, where he developed a role-playing game presenting possible forms of a post-apocalyptic utopia based on the famous computer game Sims. In 2016, he was already part of the double feature with his piece Der Geist Flesh Feast, in which he explores social processes and the power structures they reproduce. In this work particularly deals with the digitally driven consciousness and the forces for optimizing our physical and mental faculties. Today, Ed is his newest project, Cell, from 2019. This film draws the attention to patriarchal structures and toxic masculinity. The video documents a 72-hour performance where we see, or rather enter, a so-called live-action role-play, short LARP, a specific kind of role-playing game where players physically portray their characters in the simulated reality. The 10 participants in Cell embody the simulation of a group of alt-right gamers. Through this enactment of an extremist group, the work explores ideologies that generate aggressive expressions of masculinity, ultimately to find a way to subvert them. Is that right?
Thank you for explaining it, because it is often quite difficult to sort of lay the foundational framework of what that piece is. But yes.
Yeah. But can you tell us a little bit more about Cell? Like, how did you create it, or how did you come up with it?
Well, I think the desire to do so came very much from looking at online communities and noticing how these ideas of being traditional or trad within gamer groups was gaining momentum and weight. And you can see that in people like Jordan Peterson, who became incredibly popular, not just with teenagers and young people, but also older men. And I think that there's something within that message which tries to get men to sort of double down on repression, essentially, and replicate what I consider quite damaging patterns of behavior. I mean, there are some, obviously, you can look at the positive aspects of it, but yeah. So the point was to try to deal with that movement, and doing so, I think I turned to roleplay, which is something that I've been using for a long time now, and developed the mechanics with a LARP designer called Nina Runen Essendrop, who comes from the Nordic art LARP scene. And so together we developed these rules and protocols for behavior by which participants would live for the 3 days that they were in Cell. And so the premise is quite simply that the first half is predicated on the rule that you should always have somebody lower than yourself. So you're always trying to push people down. And that might be through physical acts, through fighting, that we sort of, again, developed rules for, so it's done in a safe way, or mental or verbal kind of means. And then the second half of the work all of those structures that existed before that gave characters and participants meaning get taken away, and then new structures have to sort of be developed. And so for that half, we took very much from, I know, therapeutic devices, again, things from LARP and Roleplay that Nina brought in, and a bunch of other places.
Yeah, I was very fascinated by the concept of LARP. It was new to me. And I was wondering how it is like, because watching Cell, the like, you don't really know what's real and what's, you know that it's like a role-playing game, but how is it, because you were one of the participants as well, right?
Yeah.
How was it for you to be inside the game? Like, did you have this feeling of, okay, is this still the game, or was it blurry?
It's the value of roleplay, and in general, I think, is that you enter an immersive state where things are real. You know, if things are happening to you, they're happening to you, and you're responding to them in the moment. But the valuable thing about roleplay in general is that you move away from that immersive state, and you get to reflect on it. So that's why it's important for me that the film gets shown with this thing called the debrief, which would happen at the beginning of each day and at the end, which allows people and characters to reflect on their experiences and to share those experiences with everybody else, so we're all on the same page. And you know, and within the debrief as well, there's a structure whereby people are talking about their character, like how their character's feeling, which is a part of themselves essentially, and how them as participants are feeling, and how it might relate to past experiences. So for me, the whole experience really reminded me of maybe it was designed to do this. It reminded me of being in school and perhaps some of the harder moments that I experienced there. And was a place where I was allowed to sort of revisit those experiences and perhaps confront them.
Okay. But how did you come up with those rules? Like, it seems really important because it's such a violent and extreme situation. How did you develop them? Did you have a script as well? Did you have like kind of safe words or...
Yeah, so there's a few different levels of rules that were applied. We had a script, as it were, which is just a list of actions which you could perform. So that might be, I would challenge you to a fight, and then there'd be a room in a space where a certain kind of wrestling was done. It might be, there's actually a dominatrix who participated in the work, and she brought in a horrible rule, which was called tickle. And so you restrain somebody with your legs, and then you start tickling them.
Oh my God.
Until they say, no more, start punching me, please. And then you start punching them, and then they say, please tickle me. It's a nightmare. It's a terrible thing. So there's...
That sounds traumatizing.
It was, well, it is what it was. And then there are the safety mechanics, which are super important. So if I say the word break, the people around me will back off, and whatever's happening to me, it might still happen, but it will happen slowly and in a more soft manner. You can also call for it to be stopped, so like that's everything stops, and everybody will review the situation. Everyone goes out of play.
Okay.
We created, that was never used, but the break was, and it was actually really nice to see the safety features being used in various points. We also have this symbol, which is a symbol associated with the alt-right, but in our instance, we used it to let people know that we were okay. Because the hard thing is actually when someone's performing this violence or performing aesthetics of violence, they themselves are concerned, obviously, with the person that they're doing it to. So it's really important for that person to be told, it's okay, I'm totally all right, don't worry about me, keep going, you're doing great. Because for me, like, the amount of trust, and I still feel incredibly attached to the people that we did this work with, was very high. Like, I was waterboarded at one point, and that could only happen because I was communicating the whole time, and they felt safe in doing it, and I felt safe in them performing that to me or on me.
Wow, that sounds very intense, but yeah, and also like a very personal experience, because yeah, or like a subjective thing to experience.
It for me, the personal aspect felt very real, and a lot of it, as I mentioned before, was revisiting experiences from my own childhood, which I found very hard. And through this experience, I've been able to cry for the first time in maybe like 6-7 years, and like a lot of the men involved in this actually did. And they mentioned it in the debrief, like it does connect, and it does feel like it relates to their past experiences, which is why, for me, it was important to have this second stage where we could lead out of that and to reflect on those kinds of things.
So it was also kind of a therapeutic experience.
I would say,
in a way,
but it definitely has aspects of that. And a lot of the devices in LARP in general deploy these things from, I don't know, like it's very common that practice from Gestalt therapy end up in LARP, or like little bits of it. And actually we consulted with a Gestalt therapist in producing the mechanics of this.
I was also wondering about, like, because you examine the habits and rules that define us and our identities, and you place them into a social construct, like a simulation of a social construct, but it is a social construct. Why did you choose to enact like such an extreme, violent, alt-right group of gamers? It seems like such a like very specific and cult-like situation. How is that an exploration of more general structures in patriarchal society?
Yeah, so I think that the reason why I picked looking at the alt-right was just simply that it was becoming and is becoming so popular amongst young men that I think there's an urgency to confronting that mindset and to try to obviously question it, and to perhaps try to feel out alternatives to what might be attractive to those, and which might lead them to alternative ways of thinking that are not so damaging. But again, that is in a sense just purely a mask to explore something that I think one might say is fairly universal. I think that a lot of men growing up don't have they're not given the tools to develop an emotional language, which ends up damaging their relationships and the people they surround, as well as themselves. And I think kind of deconstructing patriarchal ways of thinking has great value, not just to the people in relationships with men in general terms, but to men themselves. And I think that, I don't know, there's so much work that needs to be done within this register. And it obviously is beginning to happen on a generational level, but it is tricky, and obviously it's a hard thing to talk about, even for arty guys or men from a liberal context.
So this lab was kind of, it also functions as a kind of reprogramming, or because I was wondering about the possibilities of agency. How can you, because first you construct this repressive environment, but I mean, your goal is to deconstruct it and to reprogram. But what's the agency?
I don't know if I'd use the reprogram, but so for me, the really important thing was that it's so easy to offer an external critical analysis of that way of thinking. And so the important thing was to go immersively into that state. Which I think, again, something that all the participants were familiar with in one part of their lives, and then to push through that. So in the middle of the work, there is a murder-suicide moment where the group kill themselves. And after that point, the after death moment, the same structures which they used to survive are no longer there. Instead, they have to sort of feel out something from in themselves, like an alternative way of being. And like within that time frame, obviously you can't suddenly develop a whole new infrastructure for behavioral patterns, but you can begin to, for instance, create spaces where people are vulnerable and where people feel safe to be vulnerable. And so even just simple acts like that, I think, are quite important.
Yeah. But it can only, like in Cell, it can only be achieved by such a ultra violent act of murder or suicide.
I think that acted as this symbolic device.
Yeah.
And it was useful in a way because it escalated the scenario to such a degree that suddenly it felt like a breaking point. At least for me as a participant. And then, and it was emotional, and a lot of us, and actually there were 2 females playing men within Cell, and they were, I think, much more emotionally sensitive to what happened at that moment, and actually led us to a point, for instance, where some of us could, it sounds so mundane, but cry, and that does even, it's so mundane, but it is actually quite a big thing for some people. At least I felt like it was for me at that time.
Wow, very, very interesting. When I was reading about your work, I came across the term of critical empathy, which I found very fascinating. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that it's now more than ever so important to engage in critical, like this idea of critical empathy, which for me is to, people do not choose where they're born or the things that led them to where they are. Like Gabor Mate has this phrase, if I were you, I would be you. The things that led you to where you are, you weren't, they just are. And so it's really important to acknowledge empathetically how people come to, I think, very damaging states of mind. But at the same time, obviously, it's important, you can't lose criticality, and it's so important to engage critically with individuals. So I think there needs to be, moving forward socially and politically, both things, to be critical, but then to offer empathy. And actually, it's very interesting to look at the alt-right again, because getting people out of the alt-right and changing their mindset is very difficult. And it has been done by a few individuals and people who work online. And often the way they do it is by critically engaging with them and beginning a conversation, by lending an empathetic ear, and then to slowly start to be critical of their ideology and the conclusions which they had reached, because those conclusions made them feel okay about themselves. So it's obviously, and it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of work that I think that men need to do to themselves or for each other. But creating that language and doing it is obviously hard and difficult.
Yeah. And were you actually in contact with any groups when preparing for Cell?
In online forums, I was looking at and monitoring content, but not directly engaging. And then I also had 2 people who work in anti-radicalization, who they are in contact with the more violent elements of the alt-right. So they would consult and advise on some stuff. But it's the reason why that subject matter is chosen is because it feels urgent. But what we created would by no means viewed as realistic. It's an interpretation of the structures that sort of sit behind people's behavior, rather than recreating something that was somehow realist.
Okay. And do you see Cell as like kind of something that developed out of your previous work with role-playing games, or
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the most.
How would you put it into?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, so it does. I've learned a lot over the years doing role play, and at the beginning, I really had no contact with the LARP community, for instance, and so I was doing things very much on my own, and I definitely made lots of mistakes, and I was, you know, very. It was exploring things, and the older I've got, and the more I've worked with it, the more I've been able to hone, I suppose, the mechanics of exploring this stuff. But to me, it's roleplay is so amazing as a personal thing, as a political thing. It teaches you about yourself, like your identity. You have your own devices and your own ways of inhabiting the world, which perhaps are unquestioned, and roleplay allows you to begin questioning those things by exposing the mechanics of behavior. And then it's also, like a way that society organizes itself. So there's a saying in LARP, which is reality is just bad LARP design. And so it is also a way of mapping out alternative ways that society might perhaps be able to begin behaving. And I'm very interested in that.
So you can actually kind of try out different realities.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
See how they work.
Sure. And also to identify like desires in yourself, to identify, I don't know, things that perhaps you just took for granted or just thought of as a simple impulse.
And how do you usually exhibit, sell as an artwork? Is it like within an installation, or do you show it as a video?
It's very difficult to show sell because it, I think, requires a lot of context in case, because it's dealing with such intense, politically sensitive matter that. So what normally ends up happening, or at least I hope to happen, is to have things like this, which is a conversation about the work. So when I first exhibited, when I exhibited Cell at Carlos Ishikawa Gallery, the gallery that I work with in London, we created panel discussions, lectures, screenings of certain films which were relevant to the content, to create a sort of discourse. And then in terms of actually showing it, in that instance, it was just quite simply the main film and the debrief film, and as well as a text. So it's constantly trying to identify and clarify a context, which I think it would almost be irresponsible just to show this film without that.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, how would you exhibit this? Because it seems like you need almost an immersive context to
and that's scary. But then at the same time, for me, it's the work as it's. The more it's been watched and the more people have engaged with the context that was hopefully created in the gallery, the easier it is to show it, and the more people get it. And that's exciting.
Yeah. Could you imagine doing a lab that is like really utopian, that like coming up with structures that are not toxic or non-toxic dynamics, which is or is that more difficult, like, because you have to kind of come up with I don't know. I was thinking about this because in Cell there's this thing of self-betterment, but it's actually like the opposite, because it's about repressing emotions, numbing down, being violent. So I was wondering if there is a possibility to create the simulation where everything is the way we want it to be.
Sure. I mean, although I would caveat that with maybe one person's utopia is another person's hell, and like,
of course.
So, maybe what you're saying is, to create interesting mechanics which would make living life better, and perhaps would nurture relationships and to make them deeper. Yeah, I think that stuff is not only relevant to do LARPs about and to help people develop that stuff, but also to practice in one's own life. There was one mechanic that I actually liked from Cell that I really would like to take more into my everyday, which is you could cover up somebody's eyes, and then when you're covering up their eyes, you can say what you really think, what you want to say, but you find it hard to say within the social group. And then the person who's had their eyes covered, they're meant to not acknowledge with speech or with their body language what's been said, but they accept it, and then perhaps that's the beginning of a conversation later on. And I think that obviously there are so many like barriers that we build for ourselves that become a problem in our relationships and in our lives, and anything that can cut through that and anything that can allow somebody to talk sincerely and honestly is probably a good idea. I don't know.
So kind of constructing something which makes communication less stressful or less, like, I don't know, socially stigmatized, or I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe can cut through the social barriers, or I don't know. Like there are lots of things that I think, and also just hearing people. I think that role play and the culture of role play is really attuned to creating experiences and then as a group listening to people. And I think that also is a powerful thing. We have this. There's a concept called bleed, which I really like and I think is important. And bleed is something that can happen from your character to the participant. So maybe, like for instance, after Cell, my behavior began changing. I had a shaved head, and I found myself walking down the street in a way that was way more aggressive than I usually would. Aggressive, I suppose. And people got out the way, which that was a very interesting thing to experience.
Wow.
And then you have bleed going the other way, which is your character bleeding into you as a person bleeding into your character, which obviously you can't help but do that a little bit. And I think you learn a lot from those movements of behavior, which often are some of them are temporary and some of them you take with you and you learn from. And then there's a thing called ideological bleed, and that's something that the culture of role play as a whole might begin hopefully influencing bigger structures around you.
But I didn't really understand the ideology part.
You might learn, I don't know, you might learn something as a group by role playing together that then affecting the way you see structures, or perhaps to influence how you build structures in your workplace or perhaps socially. That one's a bit more abstract, and obviously the effects, one could argue, are very small or slight, but it's still perhaps quite interesting.
I will definitely look into role plays. I think we are coming to an end of the talk. I would really like to ask you one last question, because usually at the double features, we also show a second film chosen by the artist, which we cannot do now because everything is different. But do you have a film that you would like to show? Or which one would you choose?
I'm just trying to find the name. The Act of Killing. I think I'm just going to make sure I got that name right. Always confuse it with one other film. Which is about which is about, in Indonesia, these men who committed terrible and horrific violence towards people who were communist in Indonesia, and it goes through the psychology of that. And actually, one of the editors that we worked with on Cell had also worked on that project, and it's, one might say, nearly an impossible subject matter to deal with. And I suppose it also deals with the trauma of anybody who is forced to kill for the state. and deals with this very complex moral quandary of, I mean, of what these people did, but as people who are on the winning side, essentially within that context, and how that has affected them subsequently. It's both a horrific and powerful film, but it has, I think, value to it.
Well, it will probably go well with Sal.
Yeah.
I
agree.
A very violent evening it would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And do you have any plans for the future regarding your work?
Yeah, I really want to get down to soft things and loving things and people being kind to each other. So, I really want to do something about harvest festivals or like May Day, and to use that to talk about a bit about where I'm from in rural England and those social structures.
Okay, sounds quite different to Sal, but
yes,
maybe that's good. Okay, so I think we will switch to the webinar now. So please, everyone who's watching via YouTube or Facebook, join us in the webinar. Then you can ask questions, and we will stay here and wait for a second. I think.